everybody, Aleks Mitts here. I just wanted to give an update on a new portfolio piece I dropped and reflect a little bit on what I've learned about it. And, this is for anyone who wants to come in and, listen to me talk about how I think about this kind of thing, or for any sort of future client that sees oh, hey, he understands how these particular things work inside of Storyline. So without further ado, let's get into the thing. I'm on my site. I'm going to go to Storyline, and it's the avatar drag and drop interaction. So I like the design. It kind of everything just sort of falls in sequentially. You've got Ba Sing Se in the background. You've got the avatar logo in the top. This really isn't about the design portion of things, even though it seems, it follows all the graphic design principles that you'd want it to follow. Now, the way that this worked before is that I would drag benders to their specific bending boxes, and then they would disappear. And you would either get the point or not get the point. After a couple of rounds of feedback, people said that they wanted to try again. And I thought, that was a light bulb moment of well, of course, you don't want to be punitive in your learning measures. So let's figure out how to make this work. And just to give you a quick illustration of how this does work, this is Aang from Avatar, and he's an airbender. So I'm going to drop him in airbender. And this score up here is a variable. And I thought it was going to be really straightforward, as in you have a trigger that adjusts the variable whenever you drop Aang into the airbending box. And this is Iroh, he's a firebender. We're going to drop him in the firebending box, and then it goes to 2. However, I was coming across a lot of problems. If I was to pick up Aang and drop him back in, then I would get multiple points without having to do anything, and I could just reach 8 without any problem. Another problem I ran into is if I took Aang off of airbending and then put him back in, it would also give me extra points. And I really didn't want to do, any sort of punitive scoring or anything. I also ran into the problem that if I kept using that trick of picking him up and dropping him back in his correct spot, we would go above the threshold of 8. So I was just racking my brain on what to do. And, thank you to my instructional design friends, Aleks Drobik and Noah Mitchell, for being great resources and just storyline gurus. If you're looking to hire people, hire them. You can hire me for something as well, but they walk the walk better than I walk the walk, I'm sure. So what I did end up doing was I had to do a lot of variable changing to make sure that points lined up just right. And I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and refresh this and start over. So we're at 0 of 8. And the way that we ultimately ended up doing this was I could drop Aang into his airbending slot. And if I moved him away, it would actually take that point away. So 1 goes to 0. And if I brought him back, it would go back to 1. Luckily, Noah caught the fact that if I dropped him back into the initial box, then problems would come back, but we took care of that with more variable play. And I'll open up Storyline and show what I mean. But the cool thing is I can drop Iroh wherever he isn't supposed to go. And I like these little red X's and green check marks that I picked up from Jeff Batt's Udemy course, which I'll drop a link somewhere because it's fantastic. But if I drop Iroh into firebending, I get a point. And if I take him away, I lose a point. So overall, your learners can get all 8 points if they keep at it long enough. And that's really what I want. I want this to be more of a formative assessment than a summative assessment. And that's just how this goes with the rest of the bending. So Tenzin's an airbender, Bolin's an earthbender, Katara's water, Toph is earth. And, let's say I mess up on Zuko. Oh, maybe he's a waterbender. I don't get that point, but I didn't set it up to subtract points if I get it wrong. Only subtract points if it leaves the correct state and then, based on what their variable is assigned to at the time. So drop Zuko back in fire and Pakku in water. Once Pakku's done, we press submit, and we're done with this interaction. So I'm going to take a second with Movie Magic and open up that storyline file. All right, and the storyline file just looks like this. It's a single slide. As mentioned, I follow Jeff Batt's Udemy course to kind of get the structure of this. He has a really cool grocery drag and drop interaction where you drop the healthy foods into the shopping cart and the unhealthy foods into the trash can. But I wanted to kind of take that to the next level. Rather than having 2 things and having stuff disappear, I wanted to do 4 quadrants, and I made it way harder on myself by doing the add points, subtract points. But I learned a lot in the process, which was really cool. So if we click into this thing, this is what's going on behind the scenes. I've got all of my, let's take a quick look at the timeline. Bossing saves the background. I have a background overlay to make it sort of dark. The top bar is a rectangle that comes in slightly later. The logo cascades in, the welcome to the bending sorting after that. And then the score is, a variable of 8. Up towards the top, we've got our respective boxes here where you drop in your particular benders. And then the logos, the fire, water, air, and earth, will cascade in down here on the timeline. And we have the bender box where everyone starts, and everyone is a circular image, and then the submit button comes in later. And I believe that ends up being its own layer. To give you a quick overview of what my layers are, I've got my background, which contains most of these things. The submit button is defaulted to hidden until the last chip or the last character gets dropped in. I've got checkboxes for every correct bending placement and X boxes for every incorrect bending placement. I've also got different zones that for earth, air, fire, water. I've got my correct slide, my incorrect slide, and try again. However, the incorrect slide never actually gets used, or maybe it does. But no, actually, it's not true. I believe it just always defaults to try again. Now, where the real magic happens is the triggers, and this took me a long while to figure out. And thanks to Aleks and Noah for talking me through this and planting some seeds that ultimately got me where I needed to be. So let's see, I undocked my triggers here. And another thing that I found that was actually really helpful was naming these elements with symbols. So I dropped, once I started getting into changing all the variables and the objects and stuff, I found that I was having to scroll around because you have like Aang at the top and Zuko at the bottom because it's A and Z. But if you label these with symbols in the front, like the @ symbol, that alphabetically comes towards the top. And I did the same thing with the bending boxes. I, did exclamation points, so I wouldn't have to do a lot of scrolling. So just starting with Aang, this is all the stuff I've got going on here. As far as variables go, I have a variable for every character, and I have one variable for the score. Now, these variables are all numbered variables. I started toying around with true and false, but I ended up changing them to numbers, and I'll explain why. So Aang, show the check mark on the air whenever you drop him into the airbending square because he's an airbender. We're going to show the X layers for earth, fire, and water whenever he gets dropped into earth, fire, and water because he's not a bender in any of those elements. Now here's where it gets kind of tricky. In the variables, Aang variable is a number variable that defaults to 0. And I'm going to call this essentially the initial state. It's like initial true and false. And in hindsight, I could probably have done this with states instead, but this gave me a much better grasp on how variables work. So everything starts at 0. We then set Aang to a value of 1 whenever he gets dropped into the airbending square. And in my mind, 1 is correct. And I'm going to add 1 to the score when the user drops Aang on the airbending square if that value equals 1. So when he gets dropped on, he's set to 1. And when he's set to 1 and he gets dropped on that square, we're going to add a point. Now, we're going to have to make the inverse true. We're going to have to set Aang's variable to 2 when you drop Aang on either the earth square, the fire square, or the water square, as long as his variable is not 0, as long as he's not in an initial state. And I found that was a trouble because every time you would drop him somewhere else, that next trigger down, which is subtract, you would subtract the score if you dropped him on a different square. Another thing I ended up having to do that Noah caught, thank you again, Noah, is if you brought him back to the bender box and then back to the air box, it would do that racking up the points thing. So I had to add the bender box to the variable 2 condition. I realize I'm not teaching this very well, I'm sorry, but I'm just kind of talking through the process. So long story short though, 1 is a correct state, 2 is an incorrect state, but 0 is the initial state that needs to happen so that way if I drop him on the wrong box first, I don't move into negative points. And that's how these variables work. And so I did a lot of copying and pasting across these different characters. I would change the Bolin variable to 2 when Bolin is dropped in these zones. And then, if the Bolin variable does not equal 0 or is no longer in an initial state. And having to do all of this changing the symbol trick came in really handy to have all that stuff right up front. And I did the same thing with the zones because I had to choose those boxes in these different triggers quite often, and naming them that way with this convention really helped. So that's my reflection on this particular piece. It was a lot of fun to make. I thought it was going to be a lot simpler than it was, but I'm really glad that I did it, because not only do I have a firmer grasp on dragging and dropping interactions, I have a much firmer grasp on how variables work. And if I were to do this over again, I would probably do this with states instead rather than variables, or explore the option to see if I could do this with states instead. I'm not sure if you can, but it's worth, thinking about, and how states and triggers interact. But anyway, if you want to, just head on over to MittsTech.com, open up the portfolio. I might still tweak a few things here and there. So if you see that something is a little bit different, I like to mess with things. But you can check this out and see the work that I put in. But thank you for watching this. I learned a lot, and I'm really glad that I got to share this learning with you. And I hope that this helps somebody out, especially if they're working through a similar type of problem. Thanks.